We are just one day away from meaningful hockey in Pittsburgh. But before we get to that, Hunter and I are going to talk about the season preview, some other outlooks, and more on this edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Patrick Damp. You can follow me on Twitter at synonym for wet. Joined as always by my co-host, the one and only Hunter Hodes. You can follow him on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. You can give our show's account a follow at LO_Penguins. And of course, we appreciate you making this part of your daily routine because we're your team every day. And before we get started, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So we are just a little over 24 hours away from meaningful hockey being played once again. The regular season is upon us. It begins officially, not counting the games played overseas, tonight with 3 big games on the schedule for the NHL. So the NHL regular season is officially here, but we will have to wait until Wednesday night for our Pittsburgh Penguins to officially take the ice and begin the 24-25 campaign. With that in mind, Hunter and I are going to take a look at the, let's say, 1,000-foot view of this team going into the season to begin the show today. This will kind of be an overview of everything going on in Penguins land, because if you have understandably been focusing on the Pittsburgh Steelers, or if you're a real sicko, the Pittsburgh Pirates up until this point, it's understandable that you might not be 100% caught up with everything going on with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So we'll get you caught up on that. Before we do any of that, real quick, just some quick notes to talk about before we head into the big preview here. One, Brian Rust is expected to join the team in a non-contact capacity today at practice. He was placed on injured reserve along with quite a few other players on Monday. And backup goaltender Alex Nedeljkovic skated before practice. He was injured in the preseason and will not begin the season on the everyday roster as he works his way back from injury. But all of that aside, Hunter, a lot of things to dig into for this year. First and foremost among them, we know it has been 2 years since the Pittsburgh Penguins have made the Stanley Cup playoffs. That's the first time that's happened since the early 2000s. And if they were to miss again this year, it would be the first time since the late 1980s that they missed the Stanley Cup playoffs 3 years running. So with everything they've done this offseason, with where this team is and where it's going, Hunter, what is your outlook for this team and everything they've done so far?
So I do expect this team to at least maybe push for a playoff spot this year. I don't necessarily know if they're going to get in. We'll touch on that in a little bit, but I expect them to be in the conversation for one of those final 2 playoff spots in the Eastern Conference, one of those 2 wild card spots like they were last year, especially towards the end when they went on that big late season run. I love the article that Josh Yohe had earlier this week, for The Athletic, where he was talking to some of the players and how they think that play can carry over into the regular season. They didn't think it was a mirage. We're going to have to see on that because that was by far the best they played last season. But overall, I expect this team to kind of be, in that middle, that little bubble area with, a team like the New York Islanders. I think they're going to be in this area as well. The Washington Capitals, I think, are going to be in this area as well. If you can see a few other teams in the East being there, Ottawa potentially, Buffalo, if they're able to turn things around, even though I'm not super high on Buffalo for this season, but they're going to be fighting with a few teams for one of those final 2 playoff spots, in my opinion. Obviously, if a couple of the core players get hurt, for example, and they have to miss some time, then we definitely have to lower those expectations to them just being flat out bad this year, because if any one of those guys goes down for an extended period of time, Pat, Letang, Carlson, Malkin, Crosby, there's a distinct chance that this team could be done this year and they're not even going to be a bubble team overall. So a lot does rely on the core 4 staying healthy, but overall, if they're fully healthy, I do think this team is going to be a bubble team, and it can go either way for them making the playoffs. I have my choice. We'll touch on that in a little bit, but that's where I see them this year.
Right. And that's, I think, a good place to really kick this off is I know a lot of people are probably wincing when you say, hey, a lot of this depends upon the health of the big three or big four, if you want to include Carlson, which we should. But that's kind of how it's always been in Pittsburgh since Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and the rest of their band of merry men have broken onto the scene. And rarely has it been this team has been so deep that they can continue to press on without all of them. We were talking about this pre-show. You look back at 2010, 2011, Crosby goes through that awful concussion / broken neck saga that he was going through that stretch of time. And then not long after that, Evgeny Malkin rips up his knee, and your number one center at the time became Jordan Staal. So this has been a thing with the Pittsburgh Penguins for the last 20 years. As the big three or four or whoever they have on the roster go, so does the team itself. But looking at this roster, which obviously not long after we finished our Monday episode, they dropped their opening night roster for this upcoming season. And if you look at it, there's a lot of new faces, and there's a few faces who will be in more prominent roles this year. You look at guys like Michael Bunting and Jesse Puljujarvi. They were part of the team last year, but not for long stretches. Michael Bunting acquired in the Jake Gensel trade. Jesse Puljujarvi went from a PTO to a deal and spent some time in the American Hockey League and was working his way back from injury. He's expected to play a larger role this year. Then you look at some of the offseason additions from this summer. You have 20-year-old forward Rucker McGroarty, who surprisingly makes the roster out of camp. Some of that is due to injuries to guys like Rust and Blake Lizotte, but there's an opening for him to be on this roster to start the season. You have players like Kevin Hayes, who's looking for a bounce back year, a young player in Cody Glass, who was acquired over the summer. Similar deal, younger player, has not quite lived up to expectation, but has a ton of potential. You've got guys like Anthony Beauvillier, who have had a pretty solid career as a middle six forward. He's been added onto this roster. Jack St. Ivany, big late addition as a young defenseman. He's expected to be on the roster for most of the season. Matt Grzelcyk, same deal, a guy who's been a solid defenseman throughout his career with the Boston Bruins. He's here on a one-year deal. So while a lot of the big names remain in Pittsburgh, Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, Erik Karlsson, you have a lot of players who were added over the summer that kind of point towards this being a little bit of a volatile roster, because you're taking bets on a lot of these guys bouncing back and getting back to form or living up to potential that they may not have lived up to. And for most of them, I think it's a safe bet to make that they will be good contributors at the NHL level for the Pittsburgh Penguins.
And this kind of goes off of what Kyle Dubas said during his media conference on Monday when he kind of just opened the season for everyone overall. There really wasn't too many big quotes in there overall. I mean, he was kind of non-committal about Marcus Pettersson. I think people need to realize that this very well may go the same way that Jake Gensel did. They're going to kind of see where they are around the trade deadline. If they're out of it like they were at the time this past season, they're going to move Pettersson. I think if they're comfortably in a playoff spot, they'll keep him. If they're on the bubble, they'll have to make a decision that makes sense for now. In the future, if I had to guess, if they're on the bubble, I think they move Pettersson, but that's also just my opinion. But the money quote for me during that press conference was this. Kyle Dubas said, we need to get away from the bottom six that has to defend idea. No, we need to score. We need to defend our asses off too, but it's not just one or the other. It's interesting that Dubas said that because during his late stages in Toronto, he was building bottom sixes that could really only defend. It felt like it was the same last year in Pittsburgh, right? Where the bottom six was okay, fine at defending, but they just couldn't score to save their lives. Now you've seen him try to rectify that over the offseason here, bringing in Kevin Hayes, who hopefully is going to be better this year compared to last year. You bring in, Jesse Puljujarvi for a full season this year. I mean, there's I think a distinct chance that Puljujarvi might lead the bottom six in goals this year. That's how good he was in the preseason and in camp. And now that he's fully healthy, I do think he has a lot more to give. You bring in Cody Glass, someone who has scored double-digit goals before in the NHL as soon as 2 years ago. You have Noel Acciari, at least at wing. He's been a 20-goal scorer before in the NHL. And while I don't think that's going to happen, I do think hopefully he has more to give playing on the wing and also not playing next to Jeff Carter this year as well. Cody Glass already discussed, Lars Eller is coming off another really good season for the Penguins. You have Rutger McGroarty obviously starting with the team. Brian Rust is coming back soon. Blake Lizotte could potentially score double-digit goals. So you're bringing in players who are decent defensively, but have also showed an ability to score in the NHL as well. We'll have to see how McGroarty does in the NHL. Of course, this will be his first game on Wednesday, but you're starting to see hopefully that balance return for the bottom six. They had that right balance in 16 and 17. While this bottom six is nowhere close to the level that you saw in 16 and 17, I still feel like at least on paper right now, it's better than what they had last year, but how much better is going to be the true question. They need more depth scoring this year because you can't rely on those core 3 to 4 to bail you out every night like they were doing last year, especially down the stretch.
You're absolutely right. And it does feel like there is a little bit more of an emphasis on putting an attack mode on the bottom six rather than them going into a shell and just having to defend and hold off their opponents until the top six get onto the ice, which is a very, very good sign. One last quick thing, or two quick things here before we head to break and look at the Metropolitan Division as well as the National Hockey League as a whole. What you were saying about Marcus Pettersson, I think that's the correct way to go, because looking at the work that Kyle Dubas has done essentially since the Jake Gensel trade has been very, very encouraging, because he's been able to restock the pipeline, bring in some talent. Is it good yet? No, but there are a lot more surer bets, I would say, in the Penguins system now than there were 1 year ago. So if they're in a position to make the playoffs, I can see them extending him. If they're on the outs again, I liked his work with the Jake Gensel trade. I liked his work this summer. So I will give him room to cook on that again if it gets to that point. But if he has kind of shown this team that if you're in a position to win, I'm going to help you. If you are not, I'm going to continue with this retool on the fly. And I like that mentality. Last one quick thing. Obviously, most people know this, but we should touch on it real quick. Former assistant coach Todd Reardon was let go over the summer after a disastrous power play performance last year, finishing 30th in the National Hockey League. In is David Quinn, and there have been some signs of life in the preseason for the power play, but as we as Pittsburghers know, preseason doesn't really mean much until the games start to matter, but there are the signs of life and improvement coming for this power play should it carry into the regular season. But that will do it for our opening segment. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Penguins, the Metropolitan Division, and the rest of the NHL as we are officially here for the start of the NHL's regular season. But before we do that, we have to tell you about our first sponsor, and that is FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And it's another big week for the Pittsburgh Steelers as they head to Vegas to take on the Raiders, and they are opening as favorites on the road as they head to Allegiant Stadium in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. So you'll be able to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, welcome back to the Tuesday edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm Patrick Damp. That's Hunter Hodes. And here we are, buddy. We have made it to the regular season. We got through the dog days of summer. We did our episodes through the summer and watched this team transform. And now they head back into what has consistently been one of the most competitive divisions since its inception about a decade ago, and that is the Metropolitan Division. This year is not going to be any different. There is a log jam at the top, a log jam in the middle, and maybe one truly bad team. So Penguins have quite a challenge in front of them to get back to the Stanley Cup playoffs, not just because of how competitive the Eastern Conference is, but because of how competitive the Metropolitan Division is going to be this year. And we'll just get this out of the way early. I have the Penguins sitting at 4th in the Metropolitan Division this year, but I could be talked into them finishing lower. Hunter, what say you with the Pittsburgh Penguins?
So I have them finishing 5th right now. I have the Islanders just a smidge ahead of them just because they're like cockroaches, man. They're so annoying, but they still find a way to finish in that spot every single year, even though they don't have as much talent as some other teams in this conference do, for example. I think a full year of Patrick Waugh definitely can help them. But I have the Penguins 5th right now. I don't have them, lower in the division just because I feel like the core 4 are going to perform really well this year. I feel like the depth is going to be at least a bit better this year compared to last year. And I'm definitely nervous about the goaltending. I think that's still a very big if on this team. I think actually one of my predictions that I will say right here in this podcast, I think Alex Nedeljkovic is going to have a higher save percentage this year than Tristan Jarry. I've been very high on Jarry these last 2 years heading into each season, and I've looked like a complete fool both times. I'm not going to make the same mistake 3 times here. I think Ned is going to outperform him this year. But again, I have them in 5th. If you had to ask me right now, I have them missing the playoffs by a couple of points yet again. I know people crush me in the comments, but I just feel like there's just a couple teams that I feel like are going to beat them out by the skin of their teeth overall. Pat, I'll ask you right now, do you have them making the playoffs this year?
I do. I can see this team getting back to the playoffs, but I want to temper everyone's expectation on that. I don't see a world where they finish in the top 3 of the Metro and get one of those spots because you have New Jersey who finally addressed the one thing they needed to address last year, which was goaltending, which they seemingly waited for forever to address last year. Couple that with the fact that everybody on New Jersey was hurt last year. That was just a fluke outlier for that team because it was the ultimate when it rains, it pours for the Devils. And yeah, obviously I'm not going to sit here and say that Lindy Ruff is a great coach, but I think he caught a lot of unneeded flack because he didn't have goaltending. Half his roster was hurt. Yeah, he's a bit of an outdated coach, but show me a coach who can perform a miracle like that, and they're the greatest coach that's ever lived. So I do think they were right in firing him and bringing in Sheldon Keefe, but at the end of the day, he was served just an absolute disaster in New Jersey. So somebody's got to pay the price, and Lindy Ruff did. But then looking at the rest of the Metro, the New York Rangers, I think they're going to take a step back this year. I don't think they're going to win the President's Trophy again, but that's still an extremely good team on Broadway right now. And all the contract drama aside with Shesterkin, he is still Igor Shesterkin, the best goalie in the National Hockey League. And if you have the best goaltender in the league, you got a shot. And then you look at Carolina. I think, again, that's a team that will take a step back, but Brindamore's system in the regular season is just so effective. And that team is going to be right there in the top 3 of the Metro. And then I think the Capitals, they did well this offseason, but I look at that team and think they're kind of in the same boat as the Pittsburgh Penguins, where if things that they want to go right, they're right there in the mix. Alex Ovechkin still plugging away as the best goal scorer of all time. And that, like his counterpart, Sidney Crosby, not showing a lot of signs of slowing down when it comes to his best thing. But if the things don't go right, they take a step back, just like the Penguins will. The Philadelphia Flyers, Tortorella is going to have that team competitive. That's just what John Tortorella does. It's what he's always done. I think Michkov is going to be a lot better than people think. And simply because, I'll say this real quick, he's got the one thing you can't teach, and that's hockey IQ. He sees the game at such an elite level. Give that top tier talent and some good players in the system. Philadelphia is going to finish near the bottom of the standings, but there is a big bright light on the horizon. And we've talked about Columbus already this offseason. They're just going to be bad. They're in the midst of a rebuild. Obviously, the tragedy with Johnny Gaudreau sets them back. But I look at that, and then kind of right there in the mushy middle, it's the Penguins, the Islanders, and the Capitals, and whoever can ascend out of that mushy middle, I think snatches one of those last playoff spots.
I would agree. I think it's going to be one of those three teams that gets it. And if I had to make a prediction right now, I do think it's going to be the Islanders, but I do think they have some big question marks as well. What's happening with Ilya Sorokin? Is he going to bounce back? Are they going to get good contributions from Matt Barzal again? Noah Dobson, is he going to continue to ascend as one of the top defensemen in the league? That's still a big question for me. I think with Washington, I like a lot of what they did this offseason. Mangiapane, I think it was a good move. They brought in Jacob Chikrin. That's a really solid move as well. The Dubois trade, though, big risk, in my opinion. I don't foresee that working out, but I look at both teams, the Caps and the Penguins. I'm going to take the Penguins, high-end talent over Washington's high-end talent. I think that's the big edge for me. And with Washington in goal, Charlie Lindgren, great year last year, but can he do it again? That's my big question with Washington. I got to see that again before I pick them to make the playoffs once again, because as we saw in the playoffs, that team was not good whatsoever. I think in the Metro, I have the same top three. I have the Rangers number 1, New Jersey number 2, and then I have Carolina third. I think Carolina is going to take a bit of a step back this year. The Hurricanes, they're a good regular season team, but until I see it in the playoffs, I'm not going to pick them to go deep. Their system is very quantity over quality, and once you get them in a series, some of the better coaches in the league are able to adjust against Brendan Moore's system and work against it. So again, I still think Carolina is going to make the playoffs, but I don't see them as a top tier contender. Islanders 4th, Penguins 5th, Washington 6th, Philadelphia 7th. I think Philadelphia is getting there. You saw them be really competitive last year, even without Michkov, but then you saw them kind of collapse those last 2 weeks because they had nothing left. I think Michkov is going to have them, again, competitive this year, but I don't think they're ready to make the playoffs just yet. And their goaltending kind of scares me a little bit as well. And then Columbus, they've just been through so much these last few months. We continue to send our heartfelt, condolences to the Gaudreau family, the Blue Jackets, and the entire NHL community as a whole. But, I like Dean Evison as a head coach. I think he's going to do everything he can with that roster. But you look at it right now, Boone Jenner looks like he's going to be out for a while. That's a big loss. They do have some young pieces, but I still think they're 2 to 3 years away still from, potentially competing for a playoff spot, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with much of anything that you said there. I do think with Philadelphia, they're kind of, and we'll keep this discussion going here in the third segment when we talk about some of the rest of the NHL, as well as some of our predictions and expectations for the Penguins. But I do think with the Flyers, they are like my biggest Metropolitan Division wild card. In no world do I see them finishing in a top 3, but I could very well see this being very similar to last year, where they remain in the mix all season long and maybe surprise some teams and finish a little bit higher than you expect, just because there is some talent there. And I've always looked at John Tortorella as he's rarely ever the guy who gets you all the way to the Stanley Cup, but he is a guy who will build a foundation so solid that you have a team that is never to be counted out, that is never to be underestimated, just because guys, we can hem and haw about the way he coaches, the way he conducts himself, the way he acts. But to a man, you ask players who have played for John Tortorella, and they will tell you they will go to war for that man. So whatever he does, it gets through wherever he goes. But while he may not be a coach that can get you to the promised land, he's a guy who can get you on the highway to the promised land. But we're going to table this right here. We will come back and keep this discussion going. We'll talk about a little bit more of the NHL, as well as some quick season predictions for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But before we do that, we got to tell you about our next sponsor, and that is Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, as well as a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. So ditch the busy work and use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers, agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. I've told you guys before, while I haven't used Indeed as someone looking to hire people, I have used Indeed as someone searching for a job. And when I did, they got me connected with multiple potential employers, as well as my current employer, and it was an absolutely fantastic and easy process. And leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. So join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this very podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, welcome back to the Tuesday edition of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm Patrick Damp. That's Hunter Hodes. Let's keep this discussion going a little bit here, Hunter, about the rest of the NHL, and then we'll get into our quick Penguins predictions. I'll just ask you this one. Rather than going through every single division and putting our rankings together, can you give me a couple of teams that you're looking at this year that you think might surprise some people? I've got a couple. I'm sure you do too, that maybe they're not amongst the traditional contenders, the teams that we expect to be great this year, your Edmonton Oilers, your Florida Panthers, your Toronto Maple Leafs and Boston Bruins and teams like that. So who do you have your eye on this year as a team that some people might not be talking about, but could make some noise this year?
So I'll start in the Western Conference, the Seattle Kraken. I do think they have more to give this year. I'm excited to see what Dan Bylsma can do with this team. That's not the Buffalo Sabres, obviously. Sorry, not to be mean to the Sabres, but his tenure there was definitely not the greatest. But I do want to see what he's learned from that to bring to this job now in Seattle. I like how aggressive Seattle was over the offseason. I think a spot in the top 4 is definitely in play for the Kraken. I don't know if they're going to push for the top 3, Edmonton, Vancouver, Vegas. A lot of people are picking Vegas to take a step back. Sorry, I'm not there. I mean, Jack Eichel, Mark Stone, when that team is fully healthy, that's still a bona fide Stanley Cup contender in my eyes, people. So I think the 4th spot is definitely in play. I actually have the Kraken finishing 4th and sneaking their way into the playoffs this year. I'm not really sold on the Kings. That Doughty injury also is just really bad overall, but I like their forward depth. I like them defensively. I think if their goaltending is able to be at least average this year, this is definitely a team that can make some noise and get into the playoffs. And then for the other team, it feels like in the Eastern Conference, this could be, I guess taken in a bad way, a surprise team, but I don't see it with Buffalo, man. I feel like I really gotta see it before I pick them again to make the playoffs. Last year, I made a really dumb mistake. For listeners of the show that maybe remember, maybe you don't, I picked the Sabres to make the playoffs and the Bruins to miss. I will not be doing that again. I'm not picking the Bruins to miss the playoffs until they actually miss the playoffs for once at this rate. But I think with the Sabres, this is a big year for them. I'm just not sure they're going to be able to get over the hump, especially still with the talent level in the Atlantic. So I guess one team that will surprise in the Kraken, and then one team that will surprise people and I think be worse than expected this year overall in the Sabres. That's how I guess I looked at it.
I'm sticking in the West like you are to start with my first surprise team. And the one I'm looking at is a team that begins their journey today and tonight, and that's the Utah Hockey Club. You look at the Central Division, and yes, you got the Dallas Stars, the Colorado Avalanche, and the Nashville Predators, who made the biggest splashes of the offseason, getting Steven Stamkos out of Tampa Bay. But you look at the rest of the Central, and obviously Chicago has Connor Bedard, but they are still dead in the middle of a rebuild. They're not ready to take a next step yet. Minnesota, I mean, they're going to be in it just because that's how they always are. But then you look at the rest of that division. I think Winnipeg, they could be in it because when you have Connor Hellebuck, like I said earlier, when you have one of the best goalies in the league, you always got a shot. I'm not impressed with St. Louis. But then that leaves an opening for Utah, a very young team that is going to have both a ton of cap space and a ton of talent on their roster. And now an ownership that's actually committed to letting the general manager build a contending team, and they have a pretty good general manager. Mix all of that together, this is a team that I think very well could put themselves in the conversation for 4th in the Central Division. And a lot of their mainstays, their younger mainstays, are on decent contracts. So if it gets to the point where there's a bunch of teams who find themselves on the outs come mid-season, Utah is in a great position with a boatload of cap space, a bunch of draft picks that they probably won't really need. They could be a huge player in the Western Conference. Now, do I think they're going to go on some crazy run? No, because like I said, you still got Colorado, you got Dallas, you have the Edmonton Oilers and the Vegas Golden Knights, who are the titans of the Western Conference. And then another team that I'm going to do the same thing you're doing with, a team that I'll have to see it to believe it in the Eastern Conference, the Ottawa Senators. I kind of hinted at this in the preseason. They have to figure out what kind of team they want to be. Do they want to be like the Florida Panthers, where they are just a team of bastards that are hard to play against and it's going to be 60 minutes of hell every night? Or do they want to be a talented, speedy, finesse team? Once they pick that direction and go with it, there's a lot of pieces for both options. They just have to figure it out. Plus, they are in a big, tough division in the Atlantic Division, which will be tough for them. So those are my two. Real quickly here before we close it out, couple predictions and expectations for the Pittsburgh Penguins this year. I think you guys have figured out what my first one is by this point. I think this team returns to the postseason. Do they make any noise when they get in? Fully depends on where they're at, who they may acquire if they're in that position, and what the rest of the Eastern Conference looks like. But that's my first one. My expectation is I see this team returning to the postseason. Hunter, what say you?
So I hinted at it earlier in the show. I don't need to fully repeat myself here. Again, I have them missing by a couple of points. I'm hoping also by saying that I kind of reverse jinx them in a way, because I predicted them to get in last year after the moves in the offseason, and then they missed by a couple of points. So I'm hoping by making that prediction here that they actually get in this year, and then I look kind of foolish at the end of the season. But I guess if we're talking some more Penguin-specific predictions, and I'll put more of them on my social media after this, I think Jesse Puljujarvi leads the bottom six in goals this year. I am buying all the stock in him after the camp in the preseason. Yes, I understand it doesn't mean that much, but I see a different player overall skating on the ice compared to who I saw last year for the Penguins. And I do think he has a lot more to give for this team this year. I could look like a complete fool considering how good Lars Eller was in the bottom six last year, how Kevin Hayes has a history of scoring quite a few goals in the NHL, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to say that Jesse Puljujarvi leads the bottom six in goals. And for Erik Karlsson, he's going to return to prominence. He's having an 80 to 90 point season this year. I think what we saw at the end of the season was not a mirage from him. That was the level that I think a lot of fans expected to see Karlsson be at for the full season. And I think you will get that for this full season here. I think he's going to play at a very high level, and he's going to be around a point per game, if not a little higher than a point per game this season. Those are some individual player performance predictions that I have. I'll have a few more on my Twitter page after the show, but wanted to put a couple of those out there right now for you all. And then also, real quickly, who wins the Stanley Cup this year? I hate saying it. I'm going to put my mouth to it, though. I think the Cup returns to Canada and Edmonton takes it this year. I think that team has a lot to prove after what happened in the playoffs. I think McDavid is going to be a man on a mission this year. I think Edmonton wins it. Yeah, I know, not that much of a sexy pick, but I do think Edmonton takes it this year, even though there's going to be quite a few really strong Cup contenders. President's Trophy, this one's going to be kind of out of left field, but their goaltending still scares me right now with the health. Give me Vancouver for it. I think Vancouver's going to have one hell of a year, man, especially if their goaltending is able to figure itself out. If they can get Demko back, especially in the playoffs, they'll be hard to beat. But I think overall their goaltending will do just enough for their high-end talent to get by. And I think this team wins the President's Trophy. I could look really dumb on that by the end of the season. I very well may. But those are two more predictions overall league-wide.
No need to prolong this episode any longer than it needs to go, because you took what one of my last one was going to be, which is Erik Karlsson. I think he's going to lead the defense in points this year. He looked great down the stretch, and I think with an improved power play, he'll be right in line to lead the defenseman on the Penguins in points. I don't know if I'm going to pick them as the winner, but I think I'm going to pick them as Edmonton's opponent in the Stanley Cup final. And it breaks my heart to say it as a Penguins fan, but I think their opponent is going to be the New York Rangers, because with all of the players that they have to get re-signed, with everything going on with Igor Shesterkin, this feels like a last dance team. And this is a team that has a lot of chemistry, a lot of history together. And I think they know this is their last best shot for right now. So I think an Edmonton, New York final is what we're staring at. I think this is going to be a President's Trophy year for Vegas because no one's writing them off, but they're talking like people are writing them off. And I think they're just going to continue to be a juggernaut and they'll just go ahead and do that. But those are the predictions I'll have for that. And hey, about 24 hours to go here before the Penguins drop the puck on the season, which means Hunter and I will be back with a new episode for you bright and early on Wednesday to get you set for the regular season opener and whatever else may transpire between now and then. But for today's episode, for Hunter Hodes, I'm Patrick Damp. Thank you as always for tuning in. We'll be back with a fresh episode, like I said, bright and early Wednesday morning to get you ready for the opening of the regular season. Buckle up, Pittsburgh. It's hockey season, and we will talk to you tomorrow.